Yo, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. On today's episode we're going to be doing something a little bit different and do a dual review and comparison on one of the heavyweights of the shoot 'em up genre. We're checking out Raiden, developed by Seibu Kaihatsu and published by Tecmo for the arcade in 1990, which will receive numerous console ports over the years including the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Atari Jaguar, and Sony PlayStation. We'll be looking at Raiden Trad in particular and compare the Super Nintendo and Genesis entries. These ports were developed by different studios with each respective release, with the Super Nintendo version being handled by Micronix, Electro Brain, and Toei Animation, releasing in 1992, while the Sega Genesis version was developed by Micronet, releasing in 1991. Both entries remain faithful to the arcade original coin-op, but one of the lot checks off a few more boxes than the other. Though before we get much further, let's check out the story here. In the year 2090, the planet Earth is invaded by an alien race known as the Chrysalis. They've made headway in their ambitions of domination by seizing control of the majority of the planet's military hardware. In the midst of the invasion, an organization known as the VCD, short for Vanquish Crystal Defense, developed and manufactured the Thunder Attack craft, which is based upon crystal technology. The VCD then deploys the craft to enter the fight and push back the alien forces as Earth's last and only hope. Gameplay-wise, you've got a 2D vertical shoot 'em up that's a classic in its own right, being one of the most prolific franchises in the genre. Throughout 8 challenging stages, you'll cut down the enemy ranks as you blast everything on the planet with reckless abandon. This is a pretty straightforward affair with one-hit deaths and the option of 2 weapon power-ups, being either the Vulcan Cannon with widespread or the Laser Beam, which has a tighter spread and more concentrated damage. You've also got the option of equipping homing or cluster missiles based on which icon you grab during gameplay. You can also pick up and stack numerous screen-clearing bombs with the occasional extra life as well. Gameplay is fairly simple. Get through each stage's gauntlet of aerial and ground-based enemies, fight the boss at the end, and then proceed to the next stage. Grabbing medals throughout the levels will grant bonus points, and once your weapon of choice is fully upgraded, you'll get bonus points for each additional pickup until you get shot down. You also get bonus points for remaining bomb stocks at the end of each level. And akin to teleplane shooters, memorization is going to be important, along with dodging and bullet hurting to get through the more heated battles. The game is fairly challenging considering that the arcade version had one-hit deaths and respawns back at the last checkpoint, which the Genesis version retains, including on boss encounters, whereas the Super Nintendo version lets you respawn right back where you left off, making it the easier of the two in regards of there being a less of a penalty for getting shot down. In the Genesis version, you also lose extra bomb stocks if you're shot down, but not in the Super Nintendo version, which is interesting. Game speeds also vary a fair bit here, with the Genesis moving a bit faster as far as pacing and enemy behavior. Enemies spawn in higher numbers and slightly quicker speeds with their motion and bullet speeds. The Super Nintendo will spawn in the bigger enemies at the same rate as the Genesis version, but with less ads on screen at a time. The bridge section on stage 2 was a good example, with there being 8 tanks on the bridge in 2 rows of 4, whereas the Super Nintendo version has less tanks on the same section and spreading them out along the bridge in formations of 2. Bosses will also pulse red and orange when they're on the verge of defeat in the Genesis version, while they do not in the Super Nintendo version. Scores also reset on continues regardless of which version you're playing though. The Genesis version does also have an extra stage once you clear the game, but once you run out of stocks, it's game over and back to stage 1. You still get all 8 levels between both versions, and all the level layouts are about the same, with a few subtle graphical differences we'll get into a little bit later. One of the major differences between the two versions is that the Super Nintendo version allows for 2-player simultaneous play, which can help make the mission a bit easier with the extra firepower, while the Genesis version is single player only. Both versions have their advantages and drawbacks, though from a gameplay standpoint they're similar, but the Genesis version stays closer to the arcade coin-op with its difficulty, whereas the Super Nintendo version is a little bit easier with its instant respawns and letting you keep your bomb stocks after losing a life. Graphics wise, Raiden Trad does look decent for the time of release, even considering Seibu Kaihatsu's arcade release of Dynamite Duke didn't break sales records, prompting the use of slightly cheaper hardware to power the arcade coin-op of Raiden. This machine did better than their past arcade releases, and the ports received mixed reviews across the console releases. There were a couple of graphical issues mentioned in the gameplay section, and we'll discuss a few of those in a little bit more depth as far as noticeable changes. The first of several visual differences is the Super Nintendo version is cropped compared to the Sega Genesis version. With the camera being as zoomed in on the board as it is, the SNES version allows you to sit in certain spots and just decimate whatever's in front of you once your Vulcan Cannon is fully upgraded. The Super Nintendo version also does away with the sidebar display that the Genesis was released with a year prior. Taking it back to the question of game speeds, the Genesis version does move a bit faster with enemies coming in and out of the playfield, as well as bullets going up and down screen faster than the Super Nintendo version. While both versions have all 8 original levels, there's a couple differences in a few of them. The beginning of stage 6 has a part where you land and depart from an interstellar carrier as you launch into space for the last 3 levels, and this part is slightly different between the two versions, considering the Genesis version shows the Thunder Fighter temporarily dock before thrusting through the atmosphere, while the SNES version just goes over the carrier and then transitions into the space segments gradually. Boss sprites in both games are fairly large, though the Genesis version does have slightly larger sprites with a bit more in the way of detail compared to the Super Nintendo. The boss on stage 2 has a bunch of smaller crafts connected to it, which it'll eventually throw at you. This is one of the main sections you'll see the difference between these versions. Considering the Genesis version has more animations for its sprites, mechanics than the Super Nintendo, like the pulsing damage indicator for example. Another noticeable difference is the smaller sprite animations like the rotation of stationary turrets and tanks. The swivel on the turrets is significantly smoother in the Genesis version, while the Super Nintendo version does seem to be missing a couple frames, though they are close. Another difference is the game's end cutscene. While both have the same sequence when finishing stage 8, the Super Nintendo version has you fly under the carrier and then has some congratulatory text before going to the end credit crawl. The Genesis version shows your fighter heading further into space before returning to Earth and showing a static image of your fighter preparing to land, with a more stylized text leading into the credit crawl sans epilogue. Depending on who you ask, one may slide to one or the other as far as which is the better ending, though presentation in the Genesis version is a bit more interesting. Sound-wise, these are quite the case since both have their signature console sounds in regards to the soundtracks and effects work. Akira Sato is credited with the arcade and Genesis soundtrack, which does bang, while Copy System Limited is credited for the Super Nintendo version, which is okay considering it's faithful to the original soundtrack, just with that early Super Nintendo sound. The signature Super Nintendo percussion does come through along with some nice bass lines, but the audio slightly overrides the music, whereas the Genesis version is more balanced. While the edge would go to the Genesis for the music, the sound effects are noticeably different in both. Weapon audio is the elephant in the room between both versions here, and this is where you'll hear two very different takes on how each developer went about the game's audio. The Genesis version has the tunes out in front, which is slightly more subdued game audio, which by comparison is much lower than the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo version goes full buck with the audio, which somewhat drowns out the music. Not quite to the extent of something like D-Force, but enough to notice. The effects work on both games have their pros and cons, but the Super Nintendo has a bit more in the way of audible cons compared to the Sega Genesis. At the end of it, Raiden Trad is a fairly solid game, and these days, there's a lot of way to play it outside of the arcade. The original is a staple of the shooter genre and will go on to spawn several sequels, which we'll check out soon enough. Though for these two ports in particular, depending on preference, one may have more appeal than the other for a variety of reasons. If you're looking for an easier time that's welcoming to beginners and experts, the Super Nintendo version might be for you. However, if you're looking for something more faithful to the arcade coin-op, then the Genesis or Mega Drive version is going to be the ticket. Personally, I think the Genesis version is all around the better experience, even though the difficulty will smoke you until you get comfortable with it. It also feels more fleshed out and has an extra stage, even though it's hands down the hardest part in the game, and you only get one chance at it. Raiden Trad with the Super Nintendo gets a 6.5 out of 10, and the Genesis version gets a 7.5 out of 10. I'd recommend the Genesis over the Super Nintendo port, but depending on what system you have available, the choice is totally up to you. If you can find the Atari Jaguar version or the Raiden project for the original PlayStation, I'd recommend either of those to shoot 'em up fans if you can get a hold of them for a good price. These are uncommon cards, typically ranging between $20 to $30 loose, or between $60 to $100 for complete copies. The Mega Drive version is getting up there a bit, so play these however you can if you're interested. And for shoot 'em up fans, at least one of these should be a part of your collection, especially if you can find the Raiden project inside solid ports of the first two arcade entries of the series. We'll go through more of these sequels eventually, so stay tuned for that in the future. And thank you again if you made it this far into the video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you use this as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries come up in the near future. But until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.